I understand there are many of them. I think that is basically because I want...
His politics might finally be more famous than his hair. Boris Johnson's gone from a scruffy, clumsy vision of the English elite to the embodiment of a passionate desire to leave the EU, with some shape-shifting along the way. He attended the exclusive Eton College and Oxford University before becoming a journalist with The Times, a paper that fired him for falsifying a quotation. He then went to Brussels for the Daily Telegraph and became known for his Eurosceptic articles, but remained unsure about the EU for a long time after that. In 2001, Johnson entered politics as MP for the Conservative stronghold of Henley, and after becoming Mayor of London 7 years later, he was soon a household name. He left a mark on the capital and laid the groundwork for a career on the national stage, in particular when he presided over the 2012 London Olympics. His next move was to campaign for leave during the Brexit referendum. Although it appeared he was on the fence until the last minute, Johnson successfully positioned himself as an alternative to David Cameron's pro-European conservatism. Cameron resigned following the victory of the Leave campaign, and Johnson failed in his bid to be Prime Minister after a close ally betrayed him. Pro-Remain politician Theresa May landed the top job and named Johnson as Foreign Secretary. As the UK's top diplomat, Johnson was accused of making numerous offensive gaffes. In disagreement with May's approach to Brexit, he resigned before May's own defeat in European elections finally opened the door to number 10.
We're going to fulfil the repeated promises of Parliament to the people and come out of the EU on October the 31st. No ifs or buts.
His do-or-die approach to Brexit proved easier said than done. He controversially advised the Queen to suspend Parliament, a move eventually ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court. The Conservative Party has changed dramatically under Johnson's leadership, with many of their MPs being suspended or leaving. For critics, he's dishonest, elitist and opportunistic. For supporters, he's an outspoken and appealing politician who will get Brexit done.
Good afternoon to you all. This is pretty much a relaunch of what I think is a remarkable book called Brexit, Boris and the Media. The fact that we have to do a relaunch is we have got a perfectly reasonable excuse. The original launch unfortunately coincided with the shutdown of Britain and the UK by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister himself. It's a remarkable book in many ways because there are no less than 40 different contributors. They range from Sir John Curtis, the pollster, and Roger Mosey to Richard Tate and John Snow. But it's a first draft of history. The first book that goes right, not just the general election, but also to us leaving the European Union on January the 31st. We make no apologies for it not mentioning COVID, because COVID hadn't been invented then, so we couldn't know about something that wasn't there. There will just have to be another book on that. But what is important about this book is, as I said, a first draft of history, but it's also a barrier against revisionism and people reinventing history. This is how it was right up to January the 31st. We have 6 contributors today, 5 of them indeed contributors to the book. Three are on tape and 3 are with us live. We've got Nick Robinson of the Today programme, who has known Boris since university days. We have David Deacon from Loughborough University on how important Brexit was to the outcome, and indeed we have the Dorothy Byrne, the former head of current affairs at Channel 4, now editor-at-large. But in live today, we have Michael White, former political editor of The Guardian and columnist of The New European. Deborah Bonetti, director of the Foreign Press Association, for an external view of our strange proceedings. And Alex Connock, who I knew him as a distinguished television executive. Now he's a professor at the Side Business School in Oxford. But first of all, let's hear from the friend and to some extent admirer of Boris Johnson, Nick Robinson.
Well, isn't this bizarre? Not just the way we're talking, but what we're talking about, really. We are here to talk about Brexit and Boris, and yet all that feels almost like you're talking about the Roman Empire so long ago, it seems. But it is still worth doing it, it seems to me, because the themes in this seminar, the themes that are outlined in the book that accompanies it, will still be relevant after the great crisis is all over. Now, I've known Boris Johnson since we were students together, since we debated together, since we were hacks together. I made one big mistake through most of that time. It's a mistake I think a lot of people continue to make. I didn't really take him seriously enough. All that changed when one day I bumped into Boris, as we used to be happy to call him, walking through the House of Commons just after he'd announced that he was going to run for Parliament. And I remember asking why turn back on a glittering journalistic career as editor of The Spectator and star columnist in The Telegraph, on growing fame and fortune after starring on Have I Got News For You? Why turn your back on all that for the relative obscurity, powerlessness and the low pay of being a backbench MP? Now, don't forget how he replied. It was without the faintest flicker of a smile. What we do, he said to me, talking journalist to journalist, it's all too easy, isn't it, Nick? We don't actually change anything very much, do we? Now, many in the media have long assumed that Boris is essentially not serious about anything other than power for himself. And since he's one of us, that he won't seek to challenge the journalistic culture that he used to be part of. And my contention is they, maybe you, couldn't be more wrong. That's why I tell this story, because it's increasingly clear to me that since becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has hardened in his belief that the British media has to change or be changed. And the events analysed in this book have him at the centre. They've convinced him, they've convinced his colleagues, I think, that his old colleagues in the guild of hacks and scribblers and pundits and allied trades hold up a pretty distorted mirror to the country. And what we all see in that mirror holds the country back, they think. What we saw in the run-up to Brexit, the election that followed and the events that followed after the election and before this coronavirus crisis, was a power struggle between politicians and journalists over the control of the news agenda, the right to hold those in authority to account, of course, allegations of bias too. Now, none of that can be described as new, can it? After all, way back in the 1770s, it was Lord North who had those who dared to print the accounts of the House of Commons debate thrown into prison. And more recently, but early of my organisation, the BBC, it was Winston Churchill who berated the new British Broadcasting Corporation in 1926 for being impartial between the firemen and the fire during the general strike. So in one sense, nothing has changed at all, but so much has, of course. What is new? Well, it's the structure and the shape and the form of our politics and of our media. Politics, once dominated by parties and their HQs and their staff, now are not in charge. We live now in an era of personalities and their pop-up campaigns. So Johnson and the Vote Leave crowd, Corbyn and Momentum, Farage and the Brexit Party. And that last one proved that parties could rise and fall as quicker as your average souffle, but still have much longer lasting effects. Now, this change posed a real problem for we broadcasters, who are, let's never forget, obliged by all of us, BBC, ITN, Sky, all the rest, to be impartial. Now, once that felt pretty simple, it just simply meant broad balance between two big parties. But at the last election, in 2019, it required the BBC and ITV and Sky to take advice about how to stage TV election debates, taking into account, on the one hand, the dominance of the SNP in one part of this still United Kingdom against a far from insignificant presence all over England, Wales and Scotland for the Liberal Democrats, for the Brexit Party, for the Greens. And to make things even, we broadcasters were harangued daily, not by simply party representatives, but also champions for Leave and Remain. To give you one example, you may remember this: Philip Hammond, the Chancellor who campaigned for Remain, but was now serving in a government committed to take it out of the EU, there was a debate: should be treated as a remainer or a leaver. No surprise, really, that no agreement on that was ever found. Indeed, there was no agreement on very much between the two sides of the argument that had divided the country into angry, bawling, and all too often abusive factions. Now, politics really had changed, in my view, because the media had changed. A decade or more after it was a cliche that broadcast media was dying or had died as the dominant means of communication for politicians, we finally discovered that it might not be hyperbole. TV and radio, yes, of course, continued to command huge audiences, but it was YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Snap, and all the rest of it that opened up opportunities for the politicians to broadcast without the assistance or the filter or the scrutiny, indeed, of those pesky hacks and pundits and interrogators. Long before the EU referendum, it is worth remembering that Boris Johnson had already described my own organisation, the BBC, as statist, defeatist, and biased. And during the election, where he secured that comfortable majority, he then went to war with the BBC, refusing to be interviewed by Andrew Neil famously. And the lesson that he and his advisors took from that whole row was they didn't have to follow the rules. They could do things their own way and win. The public didn't much care, they concluded. Now, after the election, a newly empowered Downing Street then chose to boycott my programme, the Today programme, but not just us, also Piers Morgan on GMB as well. They sought to divide the parliamentary lobby into an inner and an outer circle, to exclude papers that they didn't much like. And some in the Prime Minister's circle began to dream, in the case of Dominic Cummings, of something he'd written about many years before, of creating a British equivalent of Fox News to hold up a different, alternative mirror to the nation. And with the backing of Rupert Murdoch, and who knows, help from Ofcom, or at least their acquiescence, it looked like that might happen sooner than many people thought. Now, the question this book should raise, and does raise, is what lessons we in the media can learn from the success of Boris and Brexit. I think the wrong answer is to say it's the right time to man the barricades, although we can and should, of course, make the case for journalism that scrutinises, challenges and holds to account. We can and we should argue against the destruction of the British media model, which is admired throughout so much of the rest of the world. And it is so much better than the American alternative, raucous, partisan, and all too often fact-free. However, in my view, we should take the opportunity for some self-examination and self-reflection. We need to ask why most pundits, most poll watchers, people like me, didn't see Brexit, or for that matter, Corbyn coming. We should challenge more vigorously the bias that, in my view, has blighted the mass media for decades. Not a bias in favour of one set of views or another, one party or another, a bias in favour of conventional wisdom. And we ought to find new ways of engaging with politicians and political ideas that extend beyond an interrogation or a grilling. Finally, perhaps study and learn from what you might call the Boris Heineken effect if you're of the right age. In other words, his ability to reach the parts that others cannot reach. We need to see the new world as an opportunity and not a threat. The old saying goes that it takes one to know one. Boris Johnson, columnist, editor, hack, came to a view about what's wrong with the media from which he sprung. And it's our challenge now to learn from ourselves. This crisis is already changing some of what this book is about. The Today programme has been unboycotted. There is a different tone to political conversation at the moment. But the fundamental questions about Boris, Brexit and the media remain as important to answer and as fascinating as ever.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to turn to Michael White. Did you and did most journalists make the mistake of not taking Boris seriously enough? Michael? Michael White?
He's on mute.
Michael, can you unmute yourself? Alex, you're there. We'll get him on. You're there, and you're not mute. Did you see this populism coming? You're a bit removed from orthodox journalism, coming to the wrong judgments and not seeing fundamental social forces coming down the line. Were you slightly better informed from your outlook in Oxford?
Well, I tell you what, funny enough, I was at Oxford at the same time as Boris and Nick, actually, but I was off doing different things from them. I wasn't as involved in politics as they are. But what I think we have to credit Boris for and the Tories for is what Nick alluded to, actually, which is that they perceived quite early and quite effectively the nature of kind of digital insurgency, which was taking over from the mainstream. And I think there's a kind of, since I'm from the business school, there's a kind of business dimension to what Nick was saying, which is that the business of TV and radio as the kind of sole interlocutors of politics in this country have been fundamentally challenged by the kind of Google, Facebook duopoly. And that has played out well in politics. And Boris and Dominic Cummings were very early to that. And you can certainly look at elections from Obama 2012 right through 2016 Trump, through Brexit, which of course Cummings and Boris did. And then right through to 2019, through the prism of the people who got the digital right won the election. And actually, I think Nick's right to allude to that, because I think that was a very important factor. And I think if you look at Dominic Cummings, do you remember those Hobart funnies that they used to win the Second World War? They had a kind of strange, funky tanks that they took up the beaches and what have you. In a way, Cummings went looking for Hobart's funnies earlier this year, didn't he, when he said he wanted misfits and digital thinkers in Downing Street. And I think that's what they've done, actually. They've kind of sought to outmaneuver the Maginot Line of the Nick Robinsons and Piers Morgans of this world by going around.
You obviously think they've succeeded.
Well, I think they just factually have succeeded. I'm not saying they've ethically done it, but I think they factually have succeeded by virtue of winning elections. Yeah. Yeah,
indeed. Deborah, you can look at this strange events through different eyes. I know you're based in London, but you have, shall we say, a more European view of things. Were you surprised by what happened? And did the British media make the mistake, as Nick Robinson said, of just chasing their own conventional wisdoms?
Okay, personally, I was really surprised, and maybe I shouldn't have been, because the signs were all there and maybe the writing was on the wall. But I'm fascinated by the fact that the very insular way in which Boris and the media, this discourse is being built, because it really reflects the same way in which the foreign media is completely forgotten. For some reason, everybody thinks that, of course, Boris is PM of this country and the British media are the ones that have maybe helped him or hindered him, or, well, maybe more helped him than hindered him to get where he is. But this is a global story, global Britain, as we're told every day. And the fact that Brexit was a decision that had global repercussions. And yet the engagement with the foreign media, and, I'm a correspondent for an Italian daily newspaper, but I'm also the director of the Foreign Press Association, which is the biggest and oldest association of foreign journalists in the world. There are over 500 fully working members of the FPA in London, covering Brexit, covering COVID, covering all the stories that are big in this country. And in every other country, British foreign media has the same kind of access and has the same kind of importance, let's say, than local media. Whereas here, it's completely forgotten, and it's a kind of a very, very close relationship between the government and the media here, and we sometimes, I think, forget.
I can see that must be enormously frustrating, but I've also read many articles from the foreign media, both in the United States and Europe, of far greater sophistication and insight on everything from Brexit to COVID and the huge excess deaths in the UK. It's almost as if we've forgotten that 65,000 excess deaths in this country. And where did all those coffins go? Where were all the undertakers? But it's been reported in the European and American press to a far greater degree. Yes.
It is indeed. We going back to access, we have much better access to resources there, to sources basically for our stories. But it's also true that this country has had the longest time to get on board with COVID. Now, I'm Italian, and as we all know, Italy was one of the first countries to fall very hard on COVID. We have, and I come from Milan, and Milan is in the north in Lombardy, which was really the epicenter. And it was weeks before anything happened here. And yet, you know, this is the sick man of Europe. The UK has had more deaths than anybody else on continental Europe, and it's still bandied as a success. So I wonder how that story doesn't get challenged more.
Yeah, it's a question that's occurred to not just you, I think. Could we try Michael White again? Is he unmuted?
Yeah, I was trying to unmute with my finger, mixed media, not with my cursor. Sorry.
Yes, yes. You know, gentlemen like you and I are somewhat occasionally challenged by technology, but there you are now. And I wanted to ask you first the sort of obvious question from Nick Robinson. And by the way, we apologize for some of the sound quality. It was the very best we could do in the circumstances. Nick said the mistake journalists made initially was not taking Boris seriously enough. Do you think that's a fair point?
Well, I take Nick Robinson a great deal more serious than I ever took Boris. And no, I didn't take Boris seriously, and I still don't, for reasons Deborah and the other speakers have laid out. Boris is, I put Boris in the larger context. I'm surprised nobody has. You know, Boris is a familiar contemporary type. He's an elite populist masquerading as a champion of the people against failed elites. The elites have failed, though not, let it be said, as conspicuously as Boris has consistently failed ever since he got a chance to show us how to do it. So to that extent, he is a sort of pale, more genial version of another child of pampered elite, Donald Trump. And I find it very difficult to take Boris Johnson seriously. And as for plans to reform the British media and other things given by this notorious journalistic scoundrel, him and Dominic Cummings, well, Cummings is a here today, gone tomorrow apparatchik. The poor man's Thomas Cromwell, and we know what happened to him, and it will happen to Dom too. I know Dominic. It'll happen to him too, because the civil servants will let him fall after what he's done to them, does to them every week. It's all predictable, and I'd be surprised if Boris makes it to the next general election. How will that do?
And that will do wonderfully. I was going to ask if your forecast on that later, but I will in some detail. But just finally for you for a moment, I was challenged about the title of this talk, and indeed the title of the book, Boris. Somebody came on and said, there you are, you're acquiescing in the myth, Boris, the friendly, cuddly person. Should we journalists stop calling him Boris as if he's some avuncular figure?
Well, it's a kind of tribute which some politicians get. Winston, Maggie, Clem, sometimes there wasn't much Clem at the time, I expect. Yeah, it's around, and I get told off for doing it all the time. Ken, of course, we mustn't forget Ken, all those Kens, as a matter of fact. I think they make a fair point, but it's a little wearily straight-laced to make it. We all know what we mean, and I'm happy to abuse Boris in his presence and in his absence. His name is Alexander, incidentally. That's what his family call him. Yeah, that's right. It's part of the shtick, but we all know it.
Yeah, fair enough. I'd like to bring in now on tape David Deacon of Loughborough University, and he deals with the question of just how important or otherwise was Brexit to the election result. David Deacon.
Hello, my name's David Deacon, and I'm Professor of Communication and Media Analysis at Loughborough University. Now, for my contribution to this launch of the new book on Boris Johnson and the media, I want to focus on events that might seem like a lifetime away, but occurred just a few months ago. To what extent was Boris Johnson able to shape the parameters of media coverage of the 2019 general election? Did he get the media campaign he was after? Now, my comments will draw on Loughborough University's news audit of the formal campaign, in which we analysed all weekday election news reporting in the national press and main evening TV news bulletins. Now, this was an election that Boris Johnson wanted more than any other party leader. And it's clear he intended to make a very personalised electoral bid for power. In pressurising the other parties to go to the country, the Prime Minister threatened that his coming campaign would pit the people versus Parliament. This is a classic example of what we call strategic populist ventriloquism. This is where established politicians appropriate the language and the guise of political insurgents for mainstream political gains. It's an approach that emphasises the strength and power of the leader rather than a pluralistic range of party voices. Our results show that the Prime Minister was very successful in this respect. He dominated news reporting of the Conservative Party at unprecedented levels. In 2019, Boris Johnson accounted for 55% of all the direct quotation of Conservative Party sources in television news, and 59% in the press. These levels far exceeded those found for Theresa May in 2017 and David Cameron in 2015. Now, a core purpose for all this personalisation was to ensure that the campaign focused on an issue that has defined Boris Johnson's rise to power and continues to dominate his political horizons. He wanted 2019 to be the Brexit election. Now, if you're looking for independent verification of this, just compare the messages issued by the official leader and party Twitter accounts of the two main parties during the campaign. Our analysis shows that 44% of the themes in Conservative Party tweets were about Brexit. That is higher in actual and proportional terms than those issued by the Brexit Party. By comparison, less than 5% of the tweets issued by Labour focused on Brexit. So how successful was Boris Johnson in securing this focus on Brexit? Our results show that in the first week, Brexit dominated the agenda, but then in the ensuing weeks, it became more part of the environment, the residual environment of the campaign, rather than the hot topic of discussion. And certainly Boris Johnson was sufficiently concerned about this that in the penultimate week, he voiced his concerns that people were not focusing on the core issue of the campaign. In the last week, there was a substantial uptick of Brexit coverage. A key part of Boris Johnson's big sell on Brexit was in promoting what he described as his oven-ready deal for securing the UK's withdrawal from the EU. Of course, this was just one of several policy options on Brexit that were still live at the time of the election. Our research shows that where Brexit options were discussed, it was Johnson's withdrawal agreement that gained most coverage and indeed received most favourable coverage among the alternatives on offer. Significantly, a no-deal Brexit, the only option that remains a possibility, was one of the least reported scenarios. And it is this that maybe reveals the ultimate success of Johnson's 2019 media campaign. Brexit, although frequently invoked, attracted far less of the detailed fiscal scrutiny that was prominent in the evaluation of other manifesto commitments, not least Labour's spending pledges. On the one hand, Boris Johnson managed to wrestle media attention back onto getting Brexit done in the critical last stages of the campaign. But on the other, he managed to avoid sustained media scrutiny of the policy options and uncertainties that remained. As the chief advocate and architect of Brexit, Boris Johnson managed to ensure it was both present and absent in the 2019 media election. And furthermore, he managed to portray his oven-ready solution as more or less a done deal, rather than a deal that still had lots to be done.
For a moment, we bring you breaking news. The president of Brazil, who thought COVID was just a snuffle, has tested positive for COVID-19, which is sort of a political phenomenon. It's quite interesting. First of all, Alex Connock again. How did the Tories get away with it in the election? You saw the dominance, albeit with a dip in the middle, of getting Brexit done. Was that an irresistible message, Alex, that was inevitably going to play out through social media? And Alex, you're mute now.
Sorry. So yeah, this is kind of a guerrilla warfare environment, isn't it? Where where what's going on under the surface is actually far more important than what's going on in the kind of major battlegrounds. And I think that the Tories definitely did excel in that. And actually my chapter in this book was all about something called dark patterns, which is where you do essentially manipulative techniques of digital marketing in order to sneak people via a kind of nefarious misdirection of nudging technology. If you remember, nudging was the big thing in about 2008. But you use those techniques to manipulate people into doing what you want them to do. And I think that's where the Tories really excelled. Possibly the apogee of that was the almost absurd dark pattern that they introduced when they rebranded themselves as Fact Check UK in the middle of an election debate on Twitter, and sort of effectively masqueraded as a charity, but that kind of dark pattern of manipulative digital activity was highly effective and pretty sort of transcendental in terms of the way that they infused the election campaign with their message, often well below the surface of the Nick Robinsons of this world. And I think that's, just my earlier point, is that's the kind of seismic shifts that's taken place in media over the last decade, which is that it's become a much richer environment than just TV and radio. And the Tories have seen that much more effectively, I think, than the opposition.
And I was struck by the argument in your chapter that, in a way, although the Russians tried to interfere, it was actually these techniques rather more homegrown of how you manipulate people into buying things. People were manipulated into buying a vision of getting Brexit done.
Yeah, so the Tories actually employed some very clever Australians to create deliberately bad memes or sort of for the images for Instagram, which were deliberately amateurish in order to make them seem organic. And I think that's quite interesting. And actually, coming back to the Russians, one of the problems with using armies of bots to get your message across is that it won't necessarily get it across into the mainstream. So it'll just be a bunch of bots all retweeting what the bots are saying. And actually, I've got a colleague at Oxford called Phil Howard, who's quite smartly described the gateway drug of celebrity influencers as being the people who put the message of the sort of digital underworld into the mainstream. I think that was going on too. I think the Tories were very smart at it. They weren't the only ones. Lib Dems were doing it. I think again in the book I said that the Lib Dems tried out 15 different looks for Joe Swinson in a single Facebook campaign, which they sent to 128,000 people to see which one would go down best, sort of dowdy, sexy, and everything in between. And I think the Tories were just ahead, and probably still are, in that kind of sort of iterative A/B testing world that is the reality of modern media.
Michael White, are you horrified by this, or will politics and political reporting ever be the same again? Ever like the great days of you as media political editor of The Guardian? These are dark patterns. What do you make of it all?
Well, we must guard against horror and the idea that things are fundamentally new. Carthage must be destroyed is one of the great sound bites of history, and it's 2,500 years old, and it worked. Very bad policy. So sure, several things Alex said raised my eyebrow. He talked, I noticed, about the rich environment which has been created. It's not really, it's a deeply impoverishing environment. I know that's what he meant. These things are pretty shocking, and in more normal times they'd be properly called out, if only by the Electoral Commission, which of course some of these people want to abolish. You've got to fight against it, and that means you've got to get smart and get smarter and seek more and more transparency, and to create more accountability by the tech giants. Facebook is turning away from all this nonsense and taking the money, and it shouldn't be allowed to. But these are challenging times, because 100 years ago, when Teddy Roosevelt took on the big monopolies, the White House was on the side of the good guys, but this time the White House is on the other side.
Yeah. Do you also agree that Brexit issues and Brexit implications, Brexit and economic implications, were not properly challenged by the main media? I know papers took particular stances, and The Guardian, of course, maybe was more reasonable than most. But was there an overall failure to challenge what Brexit will mean for the average citizen of this society?
Yeah, I'm sure it would have been as bad if I'd been typing every evening for The Guardian, but we were all, I thought, deficient. Even the FT, which I still read every day. I'm surprised, as I am now during the trade talk negotiations, unless you go online, and there's not a huge amount online at the FT, you don't get the kind of detail on these things, which are balls-achingly dull, but terribly important, particularly in those left-behind constituencies, red wall constituencies, which are going to be even more left behind by all this. No, we have failed in our duty to explain things we did in the campaign, and we're still failing. The television is awful, beyond belief awful.
Okay, Deborah, do you think part of the problem is sort of metropolitan bias, that journalists don't get out and are deeply shocked? Sometimes I've noticed Italian journalists and German journalists have done things like travel to the northeast of England and find great dissent and great unhappiness, and somehow British journalists didn't manage to do that.
I agree in part with what you're saying. I think a lot of local journalists don't get out enough. We do. We travel around the country, and maybe this is a very London-centric, the Westminster bubble really exists even in journalism and not just in politics. And again, if people had traveled and talked to especially the older electorate, who are the ones that have possibly had the biggest role in electing Boris Johnson with such a huge election result, I don't know how much Twitter and social media have an impact on people who are not necessarily in big cities and who are not so sophisticated. I mean, just before the elections, I remember talking to many colleagues and looking at Twitter, and it looked like it could be a hung parliament. And then the result was completely different. And so, it does help to look beyond, the patch that you cover normally, and also to look abroad, I think. But I also think something, that needs to be recognized is that Boris has brought back huge personality politics. He is the sort of, you were saying, everybody calls him Boris. We shouldn't, we should. It doesn't really matter. His personality is very flamboyant. It cuts across a lot of the nitty-gritty details that are required to understand what the EU was doing in this country, why this country maybe should have stayed in the EU. It was never really explained, because to explain it, it's too long. And in 3 words, get back control, take back control, that's easy. That everybody can get it. You just look at those 3 words, you carry on back to imperial glories, and let's forget about what's going on at the moment. And this with COVID actually couldn't have been a worse moment for Brexit to happen. It's going to be really, really disastrous in terms of all the evaluations and studies and researches that have been done. It looks like it's going to be much worse, the impact. And of course, now they've got COVID to say, well, that's the reason things are going downhill.
Is it surprising to you how little we almost hear about Brexit now? I mean, you get a single column inside newspapers saying talks haven't been going well, but again, the lack of, to my mind, the lack of explanation of what a no-deal Brexit, which looks increasingly likely, will actually mean to food supplies, to medical supplies, to blockages at the ports. I don't read any of this, and we're sort of almost sleepwalking into it. Yes?
I think what Michael White was saying before is actually really accurate. The fact that it takes it's so dull, and it takes so much determination to wade through the dullness, to understand the fisheries quotas and the sort of level playing field and all the complications. It takes a long time to sift through them. I don't know if you're not in the business, in any particular business that you're interested in these things, that you're going to do it. And the majority of people don't really want to know all these details, and it's just easier to go along with the general message. And I don't think that the media here is particularly using its role as educators. Maybe it's just I don't see any kind of massive effort to go deep into the subject. And you would think, I would argue that on the continent, maybe readers of certain newspapers, maybe sort of broadsheets, that sort of level, are more aware of what is being discussed in these negotiations. I would be surprised if people generally here are very aware of what Barnier and David Frost are talking about as we speak, even now.
So to some extent, it's descended into a war of simple slogans, as far as a lot of the British public are concerned.
Sorry, to some extent, I didn't hear.
Into a war of political slogans.
Can I
get Brexit done? But Michael, if you want to.
I just wanted to interject a short note, a balancing note. The state of European domestic politics is not healthy at all. We can take Italy. I used to think Berlusconi was an outrunner, but in fact he was a forerunner. Boris is Berlusconi. Somebody said that 15 years ago. Is Boris our Berlusconi? State of French politics, even German politics, pretty shaky at the moment. And as for the media, again, Deborah knows more about Italian media than I do, but the German media has recently disgraced itself by supporting prosecution of FT journalists who blew the whistle on the major Wirecard fraud in a major Drax company. And the FT was right and the German establishment, government and media were wrong. So it's not just us. I do want balance all the time. We do terrible things, but other people mess it up in their own way. That's all.
Yes, a very helpful balancing interjection.
I think you're right. We elected Berlusconi before you elected Borisconi, and I'm afraid you come after us yet again.
Now you've got Salvini coming up on the wire.
Okay, Salvini is a different kettle of fish, I would say. I'm not sure that you can put Berlusconi on the same level as Salvini, especially in terms of the flamboyant personal life that Berlusconi shares maybe with Boris more than with Salvini. And it is true that, you know, having been there, done that, we see the appeal of electing somebody like Boris. Lots of fun, bonhomie, very flamboyant, lots of wives, lovers, children, a big soap opera. He gets COVID, but almost, this is terrible, obviously, but he almost dies from it. He doesn't just get it and move on like Matt Hancock and let's see Bolsonaro. But, you know, so there is a clear, even in our chords, in the Italian, you know, mainstream, I think that we kind of like a character like that. I mean, we've elected one anyway. I would say that if you look at Germany, then they probably wouldn't be as sympathetic. In fact, I know that they're not necessarily as sympathetic towards Boris. But I think that what has been revealed by COVID is the dark side of Boris, the less lovable side of Boris, and definitely the fact that he seems to be the happy face of somebody, the eminence grise behind him, which has a bit soured the deal, I think, for the whole country.
Before we move on to Dorothy Byrne from Channel 4, a brief commercial break here. Brexit, Boris and the Media is available for £19 on Amazon. But for everyone who has taken part and listened to this seminar, you can get it for a tenner, direct from the publishers Abramis, A-B-R-A-M-I-S. End of commercial break. Run Dorothy Byrne of Channel 4, please.
It's but a few weeks ago that we were debating the importance of public service broadcasting and whether or not politicians need to speak at length to a mass television audience and then face questioning by journalists. In this, the crisis of our times, we're now all sure of the answers. Television is playing a vital role, probably the vital role, in informing the public and thereby helping to protect the public. We're also helping to bring the nation together as millions upon millions of us sit down each evening to hear the news. And what has been key to the credibility of what we are telling the public is that we are not speaking with one voice. This is not state television spewing out propaganda, but a range of public service broadcasters reporting, analysing and questioning. Television has relayed the government messages fairly and at length, but it has also put forward experts with differing opinions and sometimes shown experiences in hospitals and doctors' surgeries which call some statements into question. All that is essential if the public is to trust us. Only if the public have trust in the news can our society get through this. I hope this will help turn over a new page in relations between television journalists and politicians. We have always needed each other and never needed each other more than now. It's when we find a way of working alongside each other effectively that we can all be of service to the people. It seems a lifetime away that I wrote about the election television debates. I find when I read what I wrote that it is relevant to thinking about the future, and when a society is in terrible trouble, it's by thinking of the future that we give ourselves the hope to battle through the present. In the chapter, I wrote, the television debates were vital elements in the election campaign, attracting millions of viewers. For the first time in an election, there were head-to-head debates to help voters judge between our potential prime ministers. The 6 primetime UK-wide debates across BBC, ITV and Channel 4 covered a huge range of policies. However, leading politicians limited their appearances and the formats were tightly controlled. Going forward, how can we ensure these debates happen at every election, are less rigid in form, and encourage all our leading politicians to take part? They are not a replacement for in-depth interviews which are needed inside and outside election campaigns. Looking back today, viewing figures across the debates were impressive, demonstrating that television is still overwhelmingly the most important source of information for voters in an election. I thought that on balance the debates were fair, accurate and informative, but I was a bit disappointed that several debates on different channels were pretty similar in content to each other. I don't just say that because Channel 4 did a special climate change debate. I think we would serve viewers better if there was greater differentiation in content. But I don't buy the claim we only talked about Brexit. Other subjects were covered, but even when presenters tried to steer the subject matter away from Brexit, studio audiences raised it. It was hard, arguably impossible, to separate issues of the economy or the health service from the effects of leaving the EU. Obviously, the debates would have helped audiences more if all politicians had appeared in them, but overall, the debates did their job. Television did its job. But now it's really doing its job. And as I sit in the semi-isolation of an older person on immunosuppressants, I have to salute the journalists across all broadcasters who are out there now doing their bit for our free press and our country.
Michael White, what do you make of that? Television is still important and the most important medium for informing people. And do you think there will be television debates with politicians in future, or will they set so many conditions as to make them quite impossible?
I thought it was a very dignified rendering of the past, but that unfortunately Alex Connock gave us a less dignified, far more alarming and colourful version of the future. Sorry to have to say that.
You mean, by which you mean you're worried about the future?
Yeah, of course we're worried about the future. We can turn these things around, but you have to regulate and, dare I say, tax effectively for the sake of the mainstream media. Don't forget, we're all suffering a major economic crisis. The sorts of things we haven't talked here about. Larger issues of, I don't know, climate change. They didn't get very far in the debates on climate change, did they? But we haven't talked about the economic crisis which racks our industry, which is largely attributable to the rapacious role of the FANGs in stealing our readers, viewers, and advertising. That's what debilitates us and makes that scoundrel Dominic Cummings think he can stick one on us. And of course, we expect little help from the government in dealing with this. We can have a better future in which television debates play a more important part. They do tend to suck the energy out of the rest of the campaign. I've noticed since Brown conceded them out of weakness in 2010, I agree with Nick. TV, it's a kind of form of lazy journalism, of course, like most other forms of journalism, including Boris Johnson's columns, let it be said, you know, when to debate, who's the formula, who's winning, who's going first, all that nonsense. And it makes it easier for Boris, in a way. The COVID press conferences underline that. You want a press which is sufficiently well organized and coherent and cooperative to pummel them on the same questions day after day and not let them escape.
Yeah, indeed. And you mentioned the fangs and the debilitating effect, sucking out advertising from what I'm still happy to call mainstream media. I do not regard it as a term of abuse. What Michael, would you want from the fangs? Is it taxation? Is it direct a journalism funding institution? What can be done? But with these massive international players,
I don't know what I'm talking about, but here goes. You need social media platforms to be acknowledged as publishers, not as mere platforms for other people. There's a danger in that. Trump is exploring the possibilities of using it against the free press. Certainly that. They need to be properly regulated and accountable for what they run, and they need to be properly taxed. That'll do for starters, and it won't be easy, and it'll have to be done internationally. And as soon as you use the word international, you think China, because certainly the Chinese state is across all those issues with a vengeance.
So I've got a couple of things to jump in, if I may.
Please, you're very welcome.
Just on what Dorothy said. So Dorothy said television is still by far the most important source of information in deciding elections. I think we have to be careful about the direction of travel there, because one of the things I picked out from my article actually for this book was that if you look at the BBC's Question Time election special, which took place on the 8th of December, it was very shortly before the 2019 election, it was the Question Time under 30s election special, and its biggest audience was actually with the over 65s. In fact, 31% of its audience was actually over 65. So TV may have a kind of legacy role, but it's certainly not the direction of travel. And actually, I think you know, the government.
I'm afraid there's a few people here qualified. Alex, what do you make of Michael White's hope, determination, without knowing quite what to do, that something must be done on the financing of the main media, and somehow money must be extracted from the billionaires of California? Do you think that's possible, practical?
I'm not sure about extracting money, but I think if we split out regulation and business into two different categories, I think that that there is a degree of commercial pressure that can be brought to bear, particularly on Facebook at the moment, which will actually have a much better effect than any of the regulatory interventions have had so far. So I think, Ray, as you know, as a keen follower of the media, that Facebook came under quite a lot of pressure last week from some of their major advertisers to start regulating hate content, essentially, and also the adjacency of disreputable content with conventional advertising. And that's the first time that Facebook has really moved. And actually, it hasn't moved under pressure from Washington on regulation. In fact, quite the contrary, they've resisted that. But when you start challenging them on commercial advertising, that starts to work. So I think there are a number of sort of tangible things that can happen in Britain. One is that, so looking at how they place advertising. Another one is the transparency. So actually, some other colleagues of mine at Oxford did some study on the Facebook archiving of the ad library, as they call it, the Facebook archiving of political adverts, and found that it was incomplete. And one thing that Facebook need to be forced to do in any future election is to show a complete library of adverts, so that people like Michael can look at who's been advertising, who's been saying what. And sometimes that can be very revealing, because we're talking about hyper-targeted advertising down to constituencies and even groups within constituencies. And then the final thing is the Electoral Commission really needs to catch up. And so far, it's been kind of a couple of elections behind in terms of how people are actually manipulating digital marketing. So I think all these things are within our power. Just the one thing that probably isn't within our power is forcing Silicon Valley billionaires to just give us money to fund journalism, much as we would like to.
Deborah, you're a little bit of an outsider, but you live here and you know this country. The C word hasn't been used once in this hour-long conversation, Corbyn wasn't part of the reason why Boris Johnson, we'll call him, got a home run on Brexit, was because Labour policy was one all over the place. And I personally knew lots of Labour sympathisers who said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot vote for Labour under Jeremy Corbyn." Do you think that made things artificially divisive?
As an outsider, I completely agree with that. I think that it was the perfect storm. Having an opposition with Jeremy Corbyn's levels of popularity would have been a godsend for everyone, and it would be probably completely different had the Labour leadership changed in time to give it a serious go. But it didn't seem like that at all. And I think at the next election, whenever that will be, could be earlier than we expect. Should Keir Starmer be there as leader, things would be very different, especially now that we are seeing the COVID response, both from the government and from the opposition. I think things have changed, and the polls support that.
We'll move on to COVID in a minute towards the end of our conversation, but I want to ask you, I could ask Michael White, but he's sort of half said it already. I want you to do some forecasting. Will Trump stand, and will Trump be re-elected in the United States? Deborah.
Okay, can I just say one thing? So I'm not a betting person, and I never bet before, but I wanted to bet on the 2016 referendum on staying in the EU. And for some reason, because I never bet before, I couldn't do it online without sort of giving my DNA sample, and I couldn't, and therefore I managed to save my money. And then I wanted to do exactly the same for the American election. I was going to bet everything I have on Hillary Clinton winning. Thank goodness.
You know how to do it then.
I didn't know how to do it properly, and I managed to save my money. So do not take any tips from me in gambling.
But you might have learned the error of your ways. What do you think now?
What do I think now about, sorry.
Will Trump make it this time?
I would say no.
Right. So
I would say no. It's tragic the way that COVID has completely opened up. Yes. I think, the scenario and really shown a spotlight on people like Trump and maybe a bit on Boris.
And Michael White, you hinted already. You said rather tentatively that it was unclear how long Boris might survive as Prime Minister. Can you foresee an early opportunity for, after all, a strong Tory majority of 80 moving against him, so that they would have somebody different to stand against Keir Starmer?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out, because the Tories, unlike the Labour Party, have a talent for fratricide and regicide, killing the king. They work on, I don't speak German, the Führerprinzip, that if you Prinzip, if you do the job as the boss, that's great. They don't mind leaderism. We've talked about that, the Duce. But if you fail, they throw you out, Theresa. And they've done that. A number of times. I don't rule it out. Boris has an excuse for walking away. He can say what many people believe, that at 55, 5'9" and 17 stone 7, when he went into intensive care, he had a pretty bad time and has not fully recovered. You catch him on the television, he looks like death. And so he would have an excuse for walking away from.
And also he can say, I did indeed get Brexit done.
No, he didn't get Brexit done. Come on. No, we won't have that, especially not from an old FT man. He hasn't got Brexit done. He hasn't got it half done. We've just lost our voting power and influence. We're being slowly barbecued. He thinks he can call their bluff, and to a degree he might be able to, better than the grossly inept Mrs. May. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to cut a deal or suffer, as Deborah said, Brexit corpses, which they hope will be buried by the COVID corpses. It is as cynical as that.
So, Michael, sorry, Ray, can I just chip in? I think Trump will stand, and I think he will lose.
Right.
I think the reason he will lose is not because he loses the TV war, which in many ways he's winning actually, but because he's lost his touch digitally. And he's getting killed by the rebel Republicans, people like the Lincoln Project online. And they're demolishing what in the last election, 2016, was his greatest strength, which is his ability to use social media. So I think he's in a way, he's being undermined by the very same digital platform which got him through the last time.
Well, that's a comforting thought. I'm not sure. In 2014, I did something I almost never did. I sent the Downing Street press secretary, I've forgotten his name, a note saying, if you don't pull your finger out on this 2016, if you don't pull your finger out on this referendum, you're going to lose it, which they did. By September, I realized that Brexit was the forerunner for Trump and that Trump was going to win despite everything, despite his monstrous behavior, despite losing the popular vote. He's 8 or 9 points now behind Joe Biden. Joe Biden is not an impressive candidate. Surely the Republic could have done better than that. But Biden is being quite canny in terms of Deborah and Alex. He's hardly appearing on the media at all and not being there and letting Trump hang himself with the assistance of the rebel Republicans, Republican elitists, as Trump will eventually get round to branding them, already does. He could lose, but knowing what we know, knowing what we've seen, I'll be a lot more careful than even I was last time in writing off Trump. He's a monster. And there is one more caveat. If he loses narrowly in a contest between the popular vote in the Electoral College or disputed votes in some states controlled by Republican legislatures lacking scruple, who haven't yet abandoned him, as some of them have, then you might have the awful prospect of a disputed election. So Biden has to win good, or Trump has to win good. Otherwise, there'll be trouble more along the Latin American style than the one we've had. 2 disputed elections in the last 25 years, but George Bush Sr. and Al Gore were both gentlemen of the old school. Jimmy Carter too, I suppose, one-term president defeated and gave up quietly. It would not happen with Trump. We only have to say it to know it. He wouldn't go quietly.
That's probably true. Alex, I'm going to nominate you to answer a question from actually another of our contributors to the book, Paul Connock, who couldn't be with us this afternoon. And he wants to know, to what degree has the Johnson-Cummings duopoly's Get Brexit Done Without Any Trade Negotiation extension become a key factor in the blunders that surrounded the government's slow-footed initial response to the COVID crisis? Were they all too excited about Brexit to notice what was happening under their nose with a pandemic? And Alex?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Ray. And it's such a good question that it's worth another book, which in fact we are doing.
Oh, we're one and all, guys. You haven't seen The Last of Us.
Yeah, so exactly. So Philip, I've just handed
media it work already.
I've just handed in a piece actually, which about that very topic, about how we got the war against corona misinformation so badly wrong. And I think you're right. It's the same story playing out again, which is that we've tried to fight that war in a sort of conventional 19th century way, using the sort of conventional cavalry of appearances on TV and being rational and so forth, when the real information battle was being fought on digital media, on WhatsApp and Instagram with memes and what have you. And we really weren't fighting that at all. And actually, for once, I think Cummings dramatically lost his touch in that war, and really hasn't played it well at all. And he hasn't taken the digital expertise that they had and really deployed it very well. And I would actually also include people like the BBC in that, who've done a fabulous job on their own broadcasts, but haven't gone out and taken the battle to the enemy in a kind of counterinsurgency way. And that's what we've written about for the next book. And it's pretty fascinating stuff, because in all essence, the social media guerrilla war has been fought. And actually what we do in the next book is we take the British Army's counterinsurgency manual and apply it to how you would fight social media guerrillas on Instagram or what have you, bots and so forth, and foreign powers. And it's fascinating.
And Deborah, another question from our audience: do you think Boris Johnson survive if Cummings walks or is persuaded, perhaps an unlikely thing, persuaded to go? Or in a sense, it's a question is how independent is Boris of the advice of Dominic Cummings?
That's a good question. Everybody, I think, is wondering that. He's not ready to give Cummings up. One wonders what Cummings needs to do. It has really endangered the credibility of the government, what he did, testing his eyesight and going to see his family when everybody else was making huge sacrifices and avoiding doing precisely that. And it was really the time when everybody felt that it might be over for Cummings, and yet it isn't. So the dependency is there. Is there some really dark secret behind it? What is the power that Cummings has on Boris? A lot of people are asking, and should he ever get rid of Cummings? I don't know if he's going to sustain his political career enough to go to the next general election. And I just wanted to say something about that to Michael, because I completely agree that the Tories seem to be a lot more ruthless than Labour in changing their leaders. But as to fratricide, which of course the Romans have invented again, I think that you can't really beat the Miliband's recently. And, that was quite a low point. So, and in fact, Boris's brother walked away, but it was a minor stabbing. It wasn't even a scratch compared to what the Miliband's did to each other, I think. So ruthlessness is on both sides. Lovely to watch.
Well, I defer to you on the Miliband's. It was a very bad call from Ed, whose chances of being Prime Minister I've rated zilch from day one and never deviated. Never mind.
Yes, he's back.
No, he's not back. I mean, one thing, when Keir Starmer is finished with Rebecca Long Bailey and the Corbynistas, he'll have to drop Ed down a well again. Only to hear him on the radio is to make my little heart sink. He's perfectly decent chap. He's just not very good at retail. And his brother was better, but not greatly better. It would have been a better idea to let Big Brother mess it up first.
Michael, thank you for that. And finally from you, what impact do you think the current pandemic crisis will have on British politics going forward?
Well, what it ought to have is to make clear to Brexit voting, red wall voters in the north, that Boris is an incompetent who is not to be trusted. Somebody said a moment ago, what has Dominic Cummings got on Boris? He's got conviction. He has the backbone that Boris lacks. He's Boris's brain. He's Boris's compass. He tells him what to do. And we don't trust Dom, who's not as smart as he thinks he is. So the pandemic reinforces all of this. They got it all wrong, just as they almost certainly got most of Brexit wrong. And voters ought to know this. But the extraordinary potency of the big lie, which is what we've been talking about during this conversation, means that they might be able to shift the blame onto other people. Public Health England is currently in the frame. I fear for poor Matt Hancock, the health secretary, has worked terribly hard.
Somebody's got to get it.
Somebody's got to be blamed, and by definition, it isn't the Führer, so it must be somebody else's fault. It could be transformative in a positive way. There are so many good things we've learned from this terrible experience, bad things too, of course, but all sorts of things whereby we can say, we can do things smarter. We don't have to do things the way we did them before. We've got to put the economy and society back together again. Most people are much more polite, I find, in the street than they were 6 months ago. That's great. There's a downside too. I know about that too. Because, last point, if we think COVID was a threat to our way of life, boy, you ain't seen nothing yet if serious climate change starts to disrupt the world we inhabit. And these people fail to address that. Wow.
And Alex, your final thoughts?
Do you know what? I've been a digital bore throughout this whole conversation, and I'm going to stick to my guns. I think the 2020s is going to be thrillingly fascinating on the interface between digital marketing, predictive analytics, and politics. And I think that, if you want to understand politics going forward, go and look at what the fast fashion are doing, and then you will see what we're in for.
Yeah, they're making cheap clothes in Leicester and subjecting workers to COVID.
I did say finally, Michael, but finally from Deborah, what new world are we walking into at the moment from your point of view?
You know, before this conversation started, we were having a conversation about how the foreign press is coping with all these restrictions, and if we're all still, you know, fighting for our jobs, if we're still here. It looks like we're going to be here for a long time. It doesn't look like it's over, and it's a privilege to be in this country and being observers of what's going on.
Thank you to both to you and to all our contributors. And remember, Brexit, Boris and the media, a tenner from Abramis.
Thank you.
Are you still there?
Yes.
Did I contribute to that book? I can't